Welcome, Captain Moto here. Thanks for dropping in. Hey, I'm no expert. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. You know, sometimes things look pretty complicated and you wish you had some clarity. Hey, I try to make it simple. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. Let's dive in. Let's splain compression. Well, whether you're a musician or somebody that dabbles in recording and mixing, chances are you've heard about compression. Hey, maybe you've even used a compressor of some kind, a guitar pedal, some kind of outboard gear, something in your DAW. But what does it really do? Make loud things quiet? Quiet things loud? Does it add sustain? Control dynamics? Add character? Well, I guess the simple answer is yes, it does it all. We'll explain more as we proceed. How does it happen? How do we control it? Most importantly, how do we know what to control? The threshold, the ratio, the attack, the release, the input, the output, makeup gain, and then all the compressors seem to have different types of controls. What do we do with all this? Can be confusing. Let's simplify what a compressor is. It takes big stuff, makes it fit into smaller spaces. Just like taking all this air and compressing it into this little space to fit our needs. The same with audio. Let's use a visual example. Here's a family. We want to take a picture. We lift up the viewfinder and oops, Dad is too big. What do? We zoom out so he fits. But now we can't see the family faces. So we ask Dad to sit down. Hey, we just compressed Dad. Now we can zoom in so we can see everybody's face. That's how compression works. How does this apply to audio though? Well, just like in the picture, audio has some limits. In digital audio, we have limited space to work in. And if any sound is louder than that limit, what happens? It gets cut off. It gets clipped. Just like in the picture, when we cut Dad's head off, same thing. Clipped audio is not pleasant. We can apply compression, though, to prevent clipping. We can compress the loud parts to make it fit within the limits that we've set. So, now we have an answer. Does compression make loud things quieter? Yes. This is important. That's its primary function. Does it make quiet things louder? Yes. But if we tell it what to do, just like zooming in after to see the family faces, after we compress, we can add makeup gain to bring the volume up on everything. We'll demonstrate more in part 2. Let's answer another question. Does compression control dynamics? Yes. Dynamics is the difference between the loud and the quiet parts, so when we compress one part, we're changing the dynamic range. Music moves, pictures don't. Music has 2 dimensions, volume and time, and we need to make compression moves over time. But first, we need to decide what we're going to compress. We may want to begin right at the clipping level, or somewhere beneath that. Rather high, medium, or lower. That's called setting the threshold, and everything above that will be subject to compression. More on that in part 2. Let's now talk about the time element. Do we want the compressor to start compressing as soon as it hears the sound? Or do we want it to wait a fraction of a second before it starts compressing? That's called setting the attack time. And once we compress something, we need to tell it when to stop compressing. Should it start quickly or slowly? That's called setting the release time. Combining threshold, attack, and release times and makeup gain can change this character of a sound. Let's see how that works. Let's see if we can do something here. Let's see if we can add sustain. That's very popular with guitar players. They use sustain or compression pedals to get sustain, right? But each has its own different controls, so read your manual. But they all do the same thing. They're using attack, release, compression to accomplish the same thing. Shocker! Guess what? Sustain does not make notes longer. What? I thought that's what it does. No! It makes the loud things quiet, its primary function, and then it makes the quiet parts louder. Let's demonstrate. Here we have a typical waveform, and we're going to try to add sustain. These parts are louder. As normal, the sound starts loud and decays over time. Then we've got quiet parts, again normal. All these parts at the tail end have gotten quiet over time. Let's add sustain. We'll do 4 things. We'll set a low threshold to make sure everything above the line is compressed. Next, we will set a fast attack to catch those peaks as soon as they occur. 3, we'll set a slow release to hold the compression longer. And 4th, when we're done, we'll add makeup gain to make everything louder. The results is the parts that we're trailing off are now the same as the loud parts. Let's see what it looks like. Here's the original, here's the compressed for sustain. The peaks were compressed, and the quiet parts were made louder. And guess what? The length of the sound is the same. Our ears were tricked into thinking it got longer. Let's make another observation. Uh-oh, when we increased the gain, all the noise got louder. We'll talk about that more later. Now we know we can change the character of a sound, and we have one more answer. And we also know compression's primary job is to reduce volume. We tell it what part to reduce with the threshold. We tell it when to start with attack. We tell it when to stop compressing with the release time. We can make it louder with makeup gain or output gain, but we have one more question. What is it? How much should we compress? Should anything over the threshold get through? We control that with the ratio setting. Let's zoom in. Here's our threshold. We set it at 5 dB. Anything over that will be subject to compression. It's called 4:1 is our ratio. So for every 4 dBs over, we let 1 through. This is called a very mild ratio. Let's see. Higher ratios cut more. Let's see what that looks like. Here's no compression. Here's the 4:1. Here's 8:1. We're letting a little bit through and then very little with 8:1. In fact, higher ratios reduce more. Typical ratios range from 4:1 all the way up to 20:1, and that's called limiting. A limiter doesn't let anything over the threshold. Just a brief break in the action. We'll get to the good stuff in just a minute. Hey, I need your support. Here's how this works. I'm just like you. If I watch YouTubes, I see ads. Guess what? YouTube makes money on that. If I meet their criteria, which includes a certain number of subscribers, they'll be so kind and they will share some of that money with me. Isn't that nice of them? That's what I'm trying to do. If you would, please consider subscribing, make a comment. I'd like to hear from you. And if you're really getting anything special out of this, look for the link below. You can buy me a coffee. On to the show. Thanks again. Notice, this is a demonstration of how compression works. This is not a tutorial on how to use compression in your mixes. This is not intended to show the best way to use compression. You must use your creativity to apply any learnings. No animals were harmed during the production of this video. Remember, I'm just a guy splaining stuff. We left part 1 introducing the concept of limiting. Let's pick up there before we demo a few compressors. Before we get into this, let me just clarify something. We started out talking about compressors, then we introduced something called a limiter. And in some sense, they're the same, just slightly different in the way they approach things. If you recall, we said the dynamic range of any piece of audio is the difference between the loudest parts and the quietest parts. So, if we compress the loud parts, we are shrinking the dynamic range. Consequently, compressors are identified as dynamic range processors, and so are limiters. The difference is limiters use more extreme ratios, and they introduce something called a ceiling. As we learned earlier, we set a threshold to determine what we want to compress. So now we're going to talk about a ceiling. Everything above the threshold is subject to compression. We know that. And the ceiling will not let any volume pass by. Now, what happens if we lower the ceiling? And we have a threshold. We're still doing a small amount of compression, but now the ceiling is affecting the volume in different ways depending on where the volume is peaking. Okay, here we are. We're in the DAW, and I'm in Studio One Pro version 7, and we're looking at their stock limiter. Also on the screen, I have 2 level meters. On the left is the before, on the right is the after, and we'll be applying some limiting to the track you hear playing in the background. It's my song called Love is a Gamble. It's out on all the streaming services if you're interested. So right now we see both level meters peaking at somewhere around -6 and an average somewhere down here about -12, -10. Okay? And what we're going to do is I'm going to demonstrate 2 ways to make the limiter do its thing. The first thing I want to say about applying limiters is this. Compressors are typically used on individual tracks. Sometimes on the mix bus where all the tracks roll up, but limiters are more frequently used on the mix bus as opposed to the individual tracks. So in this case, we're applying this limiter to the finished mix you hear playing in the background. And typically the reason folks want to put a limiter on a finished mix is they want to increase the volume or prevent clipping. So let's demonstrate how the limiter works. First, let's orient ourselves to the controls. We have here gain. This is all these here on the left side are the input. So we have gain, we have the ceiling, which we talked about earlier, and we have a threshold. Presonus provides 2 different modes for this limiter. It's a little too complicated to discuss right now. I'm leaving it in the A mode. And over on what they call the envelope, this is the part that is being affected by the limiter. We have a fast, normal, and slow attack. We'll just leave it at normal, and then we can adjust the release time. I'm not going to mess with that for the purposes of this demonstration. Okay, so I'm going to bring the volume up a little bit on this track. And as I said, let's say, for instance, your objective here on this track is just to make it louder. If we went to the track alone and dialed up, I'm working on the lower right-hand side of the screen, dialed up the volume. Well, okay, we see what happens. It gets loud, and we had clipping, considerable amount of clipping here. So that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is increase the volume of this track without clipping. That's where the limiter comes in. Now there's two ways we can make that happen. I'll start here by using the gain. That's the first way we can apply limiting and prevent clipping at the ceiling. The ceiling is currently set at 0 dB. So if we look at these level meters, that's right here, 0. No matter what we do, because we have a ceiling set at 0, nothing will go over 0. And consequently, we will have no clipping, because clipping occurs on anything that exceeds 0. So here we go. We're going to try option 1. We're going to start increasing the gain, and as I do that, you will see that the after level meter will start to go up. I'll bring it down again, and let's make an observation. We're peaking here at about minus, I don't know, 6. So in theory, what we'd like to do is bring that up to 0. So let's adjust the gain to add about 6 dBs. Let's wait for the song to start again. So here we are. We added about 6 dB, and we can see we're peaking out at or about 0. If we push it even harder, we're getting more volume, but it's starting to distort. So I'm going to bring that down. So that's one way we can use the limiter. We can push the gain up until we achieve the level we want without distortion. The next way we can do this is here with the threshold. And remember, anything above the threshold is subject to compression. So if the threshold is set at 0, nothing is being compressed. As we bring the threshold level down, watch the numbers go minus, down, 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 we're adding compression. And soon up here on the limiter, you'll start to see a yellow bar come out, indicating that we're compressing. But the way this limiter works is, as you bring the threshold down, it is automatically adding makeup gain. Turning the volume down a little bit. So watch this. As I bring the threshold down, you'll see the output on the second level meter getting higher and higher. See it here? And the reason it's getting higher is because this threshold is automatically linked to an increase in makeup gain. So we go lower, lower, lower yet, and now we're starting to see this little yellow blip light up, indicating we're doing compression. And the lower we drop the threshold, the more compression is occurring. But it never exceeds 0 because we have the ceiling set at 0. Let me put that back to 0. Now let's mess with the ceiling a little bit. It's currently set at 0 here. For whatever reason, if we decided we wanted to bring that ceiling down a little bit, typically when we're trying to increase volume on a mix, we don't want to go all the way to 0. We want to leave it just under 0. So in this case, here I dropped it down to minus 0.76. So if we bring up the gain like we did before,
I could lose it all.
It comes in just below 1 at that minus 0.76 or 0.78, whatever it is. And the same thing here. If we start bringing the threshold level down, more and more is subject to compression.
They stay the same.
And we go as far as we can. We now have more compression happening, but it never exceeds the level we set. Now, it's all a creative decision as to where you want to set the ceiling. We can bring it way down. Let's set it here. Hell, we've got it set at almost minus 5 down here. So watch, if I bring the gain up, it never goes over 5. If I do it with the threshold, we're getting compression, but it never exceeds 5. So, what you can do, there's nothing stopping you from applying a little bit of both. So let's apply a little bit of compression and then a little bit of gain. That doesn't sound too bad. It's gotten considerably louder. We're doing some compression. We're staying under the ceiling, so we're not clipping. And at this level, I don't hear any distortion. So that's figure a job well done. Now I'm going to bring up another visual just for kicks and let you see what this looks like in color. Let's put them all back to 0. So this yellow is before, pink is after. And as I increase the gain, you'll see the after getting larger and larger, louder and louder.
I take my chances.
Now watch what happens to this pink as I bring the ceiling down.
I could lose it all.
Now, if you look at these two waveforms, the before and the after, you can see that the before has considerable peaks. We're applying, look at the top here, look at the limiter, we're applying a considerable amount of compression with this. So what's happening is these two are just about at the same volume level, but the waveform here has been flattened out. We have reduced the dynamic range. We don't see big peaks. It's gotten flatter, and the volume is approximately the same. All right, so that ought to do it with demonstrating our limiter. What we're going to do next is we're going to bring up a compressor, and we're going to start applying compression to a few different tracks in the mix. Hey, before we leave, I owe you a follow-up on the subject of noise. Remember this? Anytime we raise the volume on the quiet parts, we hear the noise. That's generally not very good. So the question is, what can we do about it? For guitar players, the source of the noises could be pickups, your cables, amplifiers, effects, other things in your environment. or possibly electronics. Every effect you put in your signal chain has the possibility of introducing noise. So don't blame the compressor. To add sustain, it must raise the volume on the quiet parts, including the noise. So try to eliminate the noise as much as you can before you use a compressor. Reduce the source of the noise first. Place the compressor before any overdrive or boost effects. And as a last resort, you can try using a noise suppression pedal. What's the source of the noise? If you're recording and mixing, it could be a microphone, room noise, noisy preamp, poor shielding on your cables, or other electronic interference in your signal chain. If you can't reduce the source, try using a noise gate in the DAW or noise removal software. That might help. Hey, join us in part 2 for more Splain'n stuff, where we're compressing instruments to the DAW. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like if you do. See you soon.